Hello everyone, welcome back to Trek A Day. If you missed yesterday's video, I think you should check it out. I found a ton of really great Star Trek stuff at the thrift store randomly, was not expecting to find any of it. Tons of great 90s PC game stuff. Really a lot of fun. I found a lot of really cool stuff. I think it was a good video. And today I actually have a question for you. Something that I've thought about because Star Trek has been around for such a long time and there's so much of it that there are so many different avenues into it that it's been multiple generations of possibilities of how you found Star Trek and how you got into Star Trek. So I would like to know how you got started with Star Trek, whether you've been a fan since the 60s or you recently just started watching in the past few years, or more like the 90s golden era. How did you get into Star Trek? And that's, I would say, is kind of like, I'm going to frame it as your Star Trek journey, because I'm going to talk about now how I got into Star Trek, just kind of my childhood, my avenues, how I got into Star Trek, and love to hear how you got into it. Really, it starts with me with TNG, the end of Season 3, beginning of Season 4. I was born in the 1980s, definitely a little too young to remember the first two seasons live, and 3 is just kind of vaguely the first really clear memory I have of watching Star Trek is The Best of Both Worlds Part 1. Because I was a little kid and the Borg frightened me for some reason. I remember that episode, and really I still vividly, even though I was so little, I remember not understanding why I couldn't see the rest, because to me I feel like there was no separation between, the story began and then it ended. There was no difference between whether it was a movie or an episode of a TV show, especially kids shows and movies. There's a very clear beginning and ending, and I just remember not being able to understand, questioning why I can't see the rest of the story. The whole to be continued thing just baffled me at whatever age that was, 4, really young. So I remember that, and then really it starts with TNG Season 4, is when I more vividly remember seeing episodes for the first time rather than in rewatching over the years. So that's where it really began with me. And then TOS, for a long time, I still have a little more of a connection to the movies, even more so than the TV series, because growing up then the end of the 80s in through the 90s, TOS was really more about the movies that we had on VHS underneath our huge CRT in the basement. We had the glass case that you'd open up underneath that had the VCR and the handful of VHS that we had at the time. Not a whole lot those first few years of the 90s, but we did have the original series movies. And so I was free to kind of re-watch those over and over again. And we didn't have any of TOS, and obviously I was too young to see when it was live. So that was more reruns. How I experienced the original Star Trek series is thanks to the Sci-Fi Channel, the early days of the Sci-Fi Channel, when it was actually the Science Fiction Channel, not the SYFY Channel. In the early days, they would pack a lot of their programming time with old episodes of the original Star Trek and the Twilight Zone. Those two in particular, they do a lot of old, especially 50s, I feel like was one of the primary focuses in some of the later evening hours of science fiction movies. But as far as shows in those early years before they really got the ball rolling, it was those two shows that I would watch over and over again in reruns. And then they would have marathons sometimes. They would have on a New Year's Day, there'd be marathons. There'd all be these weekend marathons. So the original series, it was weird because for a long time, I think really until maybe until these DVD sets started coming out, there were probably a handful of episodes that I had never seen because they weren't really in the rotation of reruns. Of course, we have maybe 10 or 15 that were on constantly, and then a bunch of other ones that I would see once a year during marathons. And I would tape some favorites off TV with blank tapes. So that was kind of my experience with the original series growing up, and it was really those movies were the thing that, because they had access to them, that I enjoyed the most, and watching those reruns of episodes, and then watching TNG as it came out, starting with Season 4, and TNG was the thing that we watched the most as a family, not just as it was coming out, but then through end of high school in the very early 2000s, every single weekday evening there would be 1 or 2 episodes in reruns, and we'd watch, or at least I would watch, almost every weekday. So I would be watching like 10 episodes of TNG throughout the week during those reruns and growing up. So there was a lot of The Next Generation. Then we got into Deep Space Nine, and the experience of Deep Space Nine was a little different because it wasn't quite the whole family get together watch type show that TNG was. This was more, I would watch it and my dad would watch it if he wasn't in his like office. At that point it was in the garage. um, and then we moved into our new house, it was still much more of a, I was the one who was really watching it. It wasn't really the family gather type shows. It was a little bit of a different experience, and this very quickly, even during the first season, became my favorite, that I've always been the most attached to. Deep Space Nine is my favorite, but TNG is the most comforting and nostalgic. Like, that's my comfort food, Star Trek, more so than Deep Space Nine, even though it's my favorite. TNG I will rewatch and have rewatched more than any other Star Trek, because that was kind of a comfort food thing growing up. So TNG was really special for that. And then during this time frame as well, especially if you weren't around during the 90s, for me, being a kid in the 90s, watching Star Trek, it was such a crazy golden age of Star Trek stuff. Not just watching the shows, but there's a period through the 90s when you look in the back of a Star Trek novel, and it wouldn't be like, these are the upcoming books over the next year or whatever. It'd be like, these 4 are coming out in January, these 4 in February, 2 more books in March, another 2 in April. It would be like the next 6 months in the list of books. And a new video game, like every year there were PC games constantly. The Playmates action figure line was like just gung-ho, like launching so many lines of action figures. It was a never-ending barrage of Star Trek stuff. So growing up, it was always my birthday. I would get a lot of Star Trek playsets or action figures, this kind of thing that I wanted. For Christmas, it was Star Trek stuff that I really wanted. It was just Star Trek throughout the year. And then the biggest thing too would be after Christmas time, because getting in the books, my mom is an English teacher and my dad was an English professor. So between two of them, reading was very important. So I was very easily be able to convince them to get me Star Trek books growing up, and Star Trek themed bookmarks, and constantly reading Star Trek. It was like an overload. I don't think there's any point in time where I wasn't experiencing some kind of Star Trek through that decade on a daily basis. And we had a library when we moved to our new house. It was around the launch of Voyager, like right around that time. It was about a year after Voyager came out. We moved to a new house, and for a period of time, the old local library before it moved was 2 blocks from my house. So getting into Star Trek books and the books on tape, I would go constantly ride my bike down there. So that was a big thing. Star Trek through the 90s was just constant. And Christmas time, I mentioned my grandparents, my dad's parents, lived in Germany. And if we were there for something like a birthday or Christmas time, we get a gift or whatever. But growing up as kids, the most common thing, because it was cheaper with the crazy shipping amount, they would usually just send us like a small gift, or like something like a pair of clothing from my aunt or something, and then some money, and we would go after Christmas sales, and I would go to the bookstore. I go to Borders usually, get Star Trek books. I go to KB Toys, and they would have every single year an after Christmas toy sale, and so I go in and buy action figures and more Star Trek than anything. So that was a constant flood. And then Voyager was the next big thing. The 2 real big things that were very much a part of that experience in the mid-90s were the launch of Voyager and Generations. I guess I'll do Generations first, because that was my first time seeing a Star Trek movie in the movie theaters. Generations, especially over the years, I've mixed feelings on. There are things about it that I absolutely love, and there are things about it that are disappointing, but that initial experience, why this will always be special to me, is being able to see that in the movie theaters was such a incredible rush. And then, of course, the depressing feeling leaving the theaters as we got to watch the Enterprise D being destroyed. But that was just such a monumental moment in my Star Trek, watching experience, as well as Voyager. No other launch of a Star Trek series has been as memorable as Voyager for me. And I've talked about this a couple times probably on my other channel over the years, and Amanda has a very similar experience with the launch of Voyager as well, very similar feelings. We've talked about it before, where because of our age range, we're almost the exact same age. We're only 9 months and 10 days apart. So we have very similar experiences growing up with Star Trek, and so we had very similar experience with TNG. Partway through is where we remember it. I know she wasn't as into Deep Space Nine as much, and just, it was more, so Star Trek was more of catching up to what our parents had watched, or older cousins or whatever. And Voyager was special because this was the first time that we were both old enough to really vividly remember and understand the premiere episode of a Star Trek series. At that point, we would have been like 8, 9, 10 years old, somewhere around that point. It was a year before my brother was born, so I was like 9 years old, I guess, at the time, and between 9 and 10. And that was really a monumental moment, and the whole family gathered to watch that premiere and the launch of a whole new network. It was like, oh, it was such a cool, like, big thing. Like, I know it doesn't mean much to younger generations, but launching like another network was a big deal. When Fox came out, years earlier, and with UPN coming out, and gathering for that moment was such a vivid memory. I remember being in the basement of our old house with the big TV. We had Metro Pizza that night. My mom and dad were on the couch. We had this big kind of brown with white polka dot couch, and my sister and I were at the little kids table thing to the side near this like fireplace area that we had. And it was such a memorable experience because it felt in a way like this was our Star Trek, because it was like our generation's Star Trek because of our age when we grew up. Again, this was the first time that it was like, this is our series from the beginning, and that way I've had a very like an attachment to Voyager at that capacity. Definitely one that I'm very, very fond of. And then the next really big formative experience was seeing First Contact in theaters, because this was kind of like a whole package deal. It was to the point where we made it at like this huge affair. We're living up, up to the movie as it was coming out. I got a bunch of promotional stuff. I got all the candy bars that they had. I made sure I collected every different wrapper. They had the whole main cast, and that was my candy for the movie. And I kept the wrappers for years. I wish I still had those, but that was a big thing. And going to see the movie, and we saw an earlier show, and stopped by the KB Toys on the way home, and I actually got to pick out an action figure from the movie like immediately. So it was just this huge, amazing experience. And as I said before, my first Star Trek memory is the Borg. And that was just such a formative thing to that really drove me into Star Trek, and was such a huge part of my early childhood, that seeing the movie with the Borg was such a big experience. And just that was really the timeline of this stuff that formed my passion for Star Trek, and then of course lived on for the rest of my life, and moving on through the other movies and Enterprise and everything. But that's really my Star Trek journey, and like how I experienced Star Trek during the first 15 years of my life, really my childhood experience growing up watching Star Trek. So I'd love to hear what got you into Star Trek. What was your experience like growing up around my age? And it was similar. Did you start watching it as a kid in the 60s, maybe during the reruns of the 70s? Or are you much younger and you started with some of the newer stuff, and you're going back with Paramount Plus and Netflix or DVDs or whatever, and experiencing the other stuff in that fashion? I'd be curious to hear, because it's been around for so long, so many generations of fans. My parents watched Star Trek. Amanda's family definitely into Star Trek. Her dad especially, like probably the biggest Star Trek fan on either side of our family, as growing up. And it's been just a family affair type thing. And I'd love to hear if you had that experience as well, because I know a lot of people had that, where it's like, my dad watched Star Trek and his dad watched Star Trek, and it's just become a thing that's always been there, like almost like a family tradition. So Star Trek hopefully will live on, and we'll keep that tradition going for many more generations. But that is my experience growing up with Star Trek, and I'd love to hear yours.